Welcome to OAuth Happy Hour with Aaron and Micah. We are looking forward to chatting today with you all. So please say something in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from and say hi. Tell us where you're from. And feel free to drop questions in the chat too. And that's what we'll be talking about today. We got a handful of other topics to cover as well, all things OAuth and OpenID Connect. So we should have a good time, hopefully. We are. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to start, Micah?
Why don't we talk about the meeting earlier this week? My first one that I attended.
Yes. The IETF ongoing series of meetings that were postponed when the in-person event was canceled. It's now turned into a series of meetings. So that was on Monday, and the topics that week were OAuth 2.1 and what was the other one? JSON Web Token introspection. So that was that took up a whole hour. But there was lots to talk about there. Would you like me to describe what these two things are, and then we can maybe talk about what's new?
That'd be a good way to start, I think.
So OAuth 2.1 is a draft that I'm working on along with a couple others, and the idea with that is to give people a new starting point for getting into OAuth. So OAuth 2.0 was made a long time ago, and it's got a lot of baggage, I guess, of like it was made for. It was made in an environment where things worked very differently. So mobile apps were barely around at that time, and a lot of things have changed over time. So in the last 10 years, OAuth has been extended, improved, made more secure, and all of that has led to a lot of extensions. So there's now a handful of extensions around doing things better for mobile apps, doing things better in different situations, and security requirements that make things more secure. And if you just start reading, I should have brought this book with me, but if you just start reading the drafts at the beginning and play them all forward, you end up with something that looks very different from the core spec. And so the idea with OAuth 2.1 is to do that and then capture that back into the current snapshot of, well, this is now what we mean by when we say OAuth. We don't actually mean all these things that we've sort of taken out of the spec over the years by writing extensions. So that's the idea with OAuth 2.1. And the meeting today was about some of the details, or not today, Monday, was about some of the details on how that should work, what that should look like, and getting some of the details written down and documented. So that was the first part of the meeting. The second part of the meeting was all about a different draft, which is called JSON Web Token Response for OAuth Token Introspection. That's a long list of words. So let's break that down. In OAuth, there is the idea of token introspection, right? So you would use that for a resource server wanting to know about an access token, whether an access token is valid, right? The response from that is a JSON document with the details about the token. So you've got things like the user ID, the expiration timestamps, and things like that. That's all fine. This is an extension that returns that response as a JSON web token. So why might you want to do that? Any ideas? Because my first thought was, well, that seems redundant, right? But it turns out the reason is because if this request is made by the API, the resource server. You're asking the authorization server, is this token valid? And then you're going to act on that information. And you're going to process a request like return data. the idea with making this a JSON Web Token is so that as the API, you can actually then later prove that the authorization server did in fact say this token was valid and that you didn't misinterpret the response. So that way the authorization server can't be like, oh, I never said this token was valid. It's your fault this data leaked, right?
Right. And is this is the idea of this, is the JWT signed by the authorization server and verified by the resource server? Or
Exactly.
is it the
Yeah.
other way around?
Yeah. No. So the authorization server creates the JWT, signs it, hands it over to the resource server, and it can then validate that signature so that it can prove that the authorization server did in fact return that response.
Right.
So
And I remember from the meeting that it's also what's one of the things I found interesting about it is that the introspection data is not at the top level of the claims of the JWT. It's embedded in a claim specifically for the introspection data.
yeah, so I just realized I should share my screen so that we can actually look at this. Because why not? So let me do this screen share. Oh yeah, cool. So this is the draft, and the idea with so are we looking at the latest version? Yeah. So
I'm not
the
seeing it right now. Do I have to click play or something? I see like a little play icon. Oh, there it is. Okay. I just had to click I don't know if
oh,
anybody else would have the same experience, but I had to click like a little play icon in order to see that.
funny. I think that's
See
just
the
on your
screen.
side because we're
Okay.
just pushing a video out to YouTube here. So the response you're talking about is let's see if there's an example in here. So this would be the response you would get from introspecting the token, right? Which is a complete JSON Web Token, which includes the header as well as this. And this is what you're talking
Right.
about, where the response is a container JSON Web Token, and then the token data itself is then inside that, right? And that was actually a significant change from a previous version, which was a lot of the discussion about this, which was, well, what is this process then? Because this is actually pretty far along in the process. So the question was then, what is the process for dealing with this significant document change so late in the IETF process? So that was, I think that was kind of interesting.
And was the
But overall, everybody
motivation,
was. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, was the motivation for having it embedded that way to be able to separate the actual introspection response versus metadata associated with the JWT itself?
Yeah, exactly. Because you have, for example, the timestamps wouldn't make sense if like the expiration date of the token were in the expiration date of the JSON Web Token being returned. It's kind of like mixing up that data, so that doesn't really make sense. So the JSON Web Token that's being returned is really just a container for the data that is trying to be protected. So it made sense to nest it then in order to be able to not confuse the properties of both the JSON Web Tokens.
Right.
Because it's actually possible that your access tokens aren't even a JSON Web Token, right? Because you can send like
Sure.
a random string token to the introspection endpoint. It'll return properties that look like what you would put in a JSON Web Token because that's what the introspection response defines. But the token itself doesn't have to be a JSON Web Token.
Sure.
So that's also that confusion of, well, where's the token data versus where is this JSON Web Token container live?
Got it.
So overall, everybody was pretty much a fan of this change and in support of it, which is good. So now it's just a question of how do we make it happen and still within the normal IETF process. Yeah,
Cool.
so that was those were the two main topics for the meeting. There's still a few more interim meetings coming up. because we had crammed a lot of topics into the week that was going to be in person, and now we're just splitting it out into a bunch of short 1 hour meetings. So, we have a couple questions in chat. Will this be available offline? Yeah, I think so. I think we'll leave this up on our YouTube, so you can watch it again later. Here's another question. Can you clarify why you wind up using JSON Web Token? I think lots of people, including myself, have seen Randall's talk against JSON Web Tokens. Yeah, Randall does a good job of making a case against JSON Web Tokens for sure.
If I could just interject really quick,
yeah.
It is important to point out that the core of Randall's talk is against using JWTs for session identifiers, as session tokens. It ends up being broadened out to be like JWTs are bad for everything. JWTs definitely have some, problems associated with them empirically, but they're especially bad to be used for session identifiers, which is like the core of Randall's talk. But they do have their place.
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of like concrete criticisms of JSON Web Token, JSON Web Tokens, and one of them has been pretty much solved at this point, which is that the header describes the signing algorithm. So there was a hack in 2015, which is what I do a talk on all the time, which was that sometimes you could just change the header information and say that your signing algorithm was none, and then modify a token and send it to an API, and it would then not validate the signature, right? Which is bad. But the fix is just don't accept that signature, or only accept signature methods that you understand. And that's like mostly a solved problem at this point. I agree that it was maybe not the best design decision in JSON Web Tokens at the beginning. We shouldn't have probably given people that way to get things wrong. But it's not the end of the world, right? So yeah, the other problems are more about how you then use them. So this is actually what we both talk a lot about in the workshops that we do, which is there are a lot of trade-offs when you use a JSON Web Token as an access token. However, those are not unique to JSON Web Tokens. Those are about any self-contained token, right? It's essentially it's a snapshot in time at the time the token was issued about the system state. It's a cache of the user ID. It's a cache of the timestamp, the scope or whatever, right? Roles that are in there. And that can go out of date. And if it goes out of date, then you might be acting on old information. And that's not a problem that's unique to JSON Web Token. It's a problem with any self-contained token. So, yeah, does that, I guess, help answer that? Any other thoughts on that, Micah?
Well, just as the business with alg none and some of the other issues with JWT, we kind of internally, we talk about JWT, the good parts. It's a little bit like JavaScript. There are some, kind of dark caves with trolls in them in JavaScript if you're not careful. It's just part of the language. But if you avoid those parts, then you get some really good stuff out of JavaScript. It's kind of similar with JWT. As long as you're working with a library that will just, reject alg none, or, you're ensuring that you're not going down those, dark caves in JWT, it has its utility. And, when you're using public key encryption and you're validating the signature, all of that is good crypto. What we're starting to look at, which is going to be, probably way down the road for anything like the OAuth standards, is Paceto, where the idea is that, the developer is saved from himself. It's kind of like TypeScript in the world of JavaScript. Like, you can't make certain mistakes because it's just not part of the language, or in the case of Paceto, it's just not part of the standard where you could have those same kind of pitfalls. But we're probably a ways off from from that being incorporated into any standards.
Yeah, definitely. That's, I mean, this kind of stuff tends to move very slowly in the standards world, much less than also making it into products. But yeah, so there was, oh my gosh, where'd my screen go? Yeah, so Lee says, what are some alternatives to JSON Web Tokens? So Paceto is one of them. That's PASETO, is that right?
Yeah.
Platform agnostic security tokens. Randall has also a good talk on those. It's essentially a alternative signing format and package around a self-contained token, and yeah, you can make the argument that there's benefits to that method of doing it. However, you are not going to solve the trade-offs you get by using those as access tokens, right? So you still have all the problems of treating those as access tokens in that you're still acting on a cache of that data, and that's not that's not going away.
Yeah, so if you could wave a magic wand and have a service that used Paceto today, you'd still have all the same issues that you have when you're verifying locally. Maybe the system state changed, the account was locked, but your software wouldn't know that because it's only validating locally. So you'd still have those same kinds of issues that you have with opaque versus encoded types of tokens.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. Here's another one.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Isn't there also an issue with JSON Web Token invalidation, or do we typically just bring the expiration time way down? Yeah, so that's kind of what we're hinting at here, which is that that is the problem with any sort of self-contained token. This is not unique to JSON Web Token. So the idea is that the token's issued and it has a timestamp of when it expires baked into the token. And then if someone's validating that locally and they look at just the timestamp, there's no way to then invalidate that, because if they're only looking at the token string itself, then it's going to look valid until the timestamp passes. So there's no way to revoke these, regardless of what format you're using, JSON Web Token or anything. If you want to be able to revoke the tokens, then you need to go look up somewhere else the information about the revocation list. So that's what token introspection is for, where you can go back and ask the authorization server, hey, is this token still valid? Right.
It's kind of part of a larger class of problem with caching in general. Like any cache system that you deal with, you have these problems of stale caches and system state changes, but the cache represents something at a prior state. It's kind of that same problem domain, and you just have to strike a balance between the efficiency of your application and the kind of live feedback of the system state.
Yep. It's a lot of trade-offs, really. Okay, what? Another question. In the authorization flow plus Pixie, why is and this was corrected, interception attack is considered? What will happen when a malicious app that takes the authorization code, they don't have client ID and secret, how can they exchange it for a token? So there's two parts to this, I guess, because in one case, on one hand, Pixie can be used with confidential clients with a client secret. In that case, yeah, if someone steals the authorization code, they're not going to be able to use it, right? Because they don't have the secret. In that case, Pixie is actually protecting against something different, which is having an attacker swap in an authorization code to the real client, but from somebody else. So if you imagine you have a legitimate client running on a web server with a client secret, the attacker gets the user to go log in and get an authorization code, and then somehow steals the code from the user before the user is redirected back to the app. Then the attacker can take that code, drop it into the app itself, and then the app does have a client secret to use to go get the token, right? So what Pixie does is it prevents that from happening because that the app has to actually maintain a session-specific secret, that Pixie secret, at on both the original machine that started the flow and also then the attacker who would have tried to start the flow. So then the Pixie challenge it would be wrong if the authorization code is swapped in. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a tricky one, but that's what it's solving.
The traditional use of Pixie, I mean, I think the answer to this question when you're using Pixie like in a spa app is that there is no fixed client secret. And if we just, as good security professionals, just assume that the authorization code always is intercepted, where it gets foiled is that the malicious app or the malicious browser extension doesn't have the code verifier that was generated at the beginning, which is like the stand-in for the client secret. That dynamic value that gets generated every time as part of the Pixie flow. So where the attacker would get foiled in that case is that they have no way of knowing what that internal client code verifier and the derived code challenge would be.
Yeah, exactly. So the I guess that's like the main use of Pixie, especially because it was made for mobile apps really at the beginning, is protecting that case when there isn't a secret. But there are benefits to using it even if there is a secret because it's just protecting a bunch of other different kinds of attacks as well.
I've kind of thought of it as like CSRF protection for OAuth. Is that a reasonable
It
way of thinking of
absolutely
it?
is. Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's actually one of the reasons that in the security best current practice, um, the one of the things it says is that Pixie is used for CSRF protection. That also means that Pixie then, or that the state parameter does not need to be used for CSRF protection, because originally the state value protects against that. So if you're doing Pixie, then you don't need the state parameter for CSRF protection, which then means you can use the state parameter for whatever else you want.
Yeah, like like application state or something.
Yeah, exactly. Of like which page did they come from originally before they were trying to log in or
Yeah.
whatever you want to do. Yep.
Is there something in the spec that speaks to that, where it would be a valid use? Like if you're using Pixie in a confidential client, then it's okay to use the state parameter for something else entirely, or is it
Yeah.
just implied?
No, it actually is literally written like that. Let me see if I can find that. So on OAuth 2, security best current practice, make this bigger so you can see it. This is the security best current practice spec. We are on draft 15 right now, published earlier this month. Somewhere in here, it says, these things are fun to read.
Yeah.
I think it's here. So this is mainly about that authorization code replay, which is the attack I described at the beginning. The nope. Okay, now I don't see it. Let me search CSRF. Protecting redirect-based flows 2.1. Clients must prevent CSRF. In this context, blah, 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 blah. Clients that have ensured that the authorization server supports Pixie may rely on the CSRF protection provided by Pixie. Otherwise, one-time use CSRF tokens carrying the state parameter must be used. And then somewhere later in here, it says, let me go back up to the top, search for state. It says, oh, that last one, where did it go? Back up. Nope, now I'm not finding it. I
Yeah.
swear it had that in there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's in there somewhere. It's just useful because I think, I know of projects and other developers that have wanted to use the state for application state, and we always had to, give them the bad news that was exposing them to replay attacks, because if the state is a fixed value, or if the application will accept the state as a fixed value, then you lose that CSRF
Yep.
protection. But
So I
now,
will
if you're
say,
using Pixie,
There is still one piece to that that's dangerous, though. And it's actually described in here.
Hmm.
If state is used for carrying application state, and if the integrity of the contents are a concern, then the clients have to protect state against tampering. So you can imagine if you've got application state in there that actually is actually significant in terms of like carrying role information or anything like that, you want to make sure that somebody can't go and modify that state value and start a flow that would result in doing something else. So if that is a concern, if you are putting stuff in there that's like sensitive application state, then you might want to use a JSON Web Token as the state parameter. But for simpler things like, well, we were coming from the dashboard, so let's make sure that we get redirected back to the dashboard after they log in, state can just be the string dashboard, right? That would be fine because that's not sensitive information and it doesn't matter if somebody changes it because they would just end up somewhere else.
Right.
But again, a caveat on that is don't use full URLs in the state parameter because then you're building yourselves an open redirector, right? So you don't want to let people be able to craft a value of their own choosing and then get somebody else's browser to redirect to that other location. That's an open redirector.
Yep. JWT comes back into the picture again. We can't get away from it.
Yeah, I can't get away from it. I mean, it's got good library support. It's fine, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question from the chat from Dimitri. When implementing an OAuth 2 with authorization code Pixie, public clients, React app, is the session storage the right place to store the code verifier during the flow? Session storage meaning, I'm assuming the browser API is called session storage. So yeah, I guess the anywhere that you can store that temporarily on the client is fine. It's only valid for such a short amount of time that like there's not really a concern about long-term storage that you would have with, for example, like storing access tokens or especially refresh tokens. So that's totally fine. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Micah? You've done more with React than I have.
Yeah, well, the code, if we're talking about the authorization code, there you don't even need to store that anywhere because that's used once and never seen again. The code verifier, you're going to need, you create at the beginning of the flow and you'll need again after a redirect. So it's got to be stored somewhere. But like Aaron's saying, it's so short-lived that, it's reasonably safe to park it in local storage. Even if you were to leave it there, if you were to forget to clear it out, it can't be used again. So it's pretty low risk.
Yep. Here's another question. Is it safe for the authorization server to return the same JSON Web Token for a client in the client credentials flow? Use case, multiple instances of a client deployed in a cloud environment. So typically, no. Typically, you're going to want to return, you're going to want to generate new JSON Web Tokens for each request for an access token. And that, especially in the case of this kind of environment where you have multiple instances of a client, because that lets you disable them independently. So if you need to disable an access token for some reason, like if one of the client machines was found that it was spewing log data into some folder somewhere, you want to be able to disable those access tokens, not have it affect every other instance's access tokens, right? So the JSON Web Token that's generated, it's going to have a timestamp, first of all, of like when it was issued. So that should just be different every time one is issued, right? Because you want to make sure you know when this token was created. It'll probably also expire. You probably do want them to expire also. And again, that means it's easier to just give a new token to each client. And then if you are trying to be able to track these access tokens to be able to disable them, you're going to have a property in there called JTI, which is the identifier for that particular token so that you can then disable that one token when you need to.
Yeah, I was also going to say speaking of the JTI, especially in, like a high availability or cloud environment where you have a load balancer or something like that, for debugging purposes, you'll be better off because you'll be able to tie that JTI to a specific instance that, if something goes wrong or if you need to shut it down or take it out of service, you'll be able to tie it back more easily.
Yep. That's another good use for sure. Cool.
And it's also something that's kind of natural to JWT. Like you have an issued at time, and if you're dealing, if you're load balancing around multiple clients, those times are going to be slightly different for different tokens or JWTs that are coming to them. So it just kind of naturally fits with the good parts of JWT. Like you want to know that this is a different one than some other one.
Yeah, for sure. What else? What else is going on in the world of OAuth?
What was the other topic on Monday's call? You did a review of the state of OAuth 2.1, right? Aside from the JWT business.
Yeah, so 2.1, we talked about a couple of particular issues in that, and the next step on that is going to be putting out an email to the list, asking if people agree that it should be adopted, because right now it's actually not an official document. It's just an individual contributor's document, which is myself and a few others, has no official standing at all right now. So the next step is to have that be adopted by the group, which then gives it an official standing in the group, and it becomes a group working item that people have agreed to spend time on. I'm trying to remember what the particular issues were that we talked about during that meeting, and I think I can't find the link to my slides. But yeah, so it was just a couple of things. It was mostly just say let's catch up and talk about like what's the next step on this draft, and are people actually interested in moving this forward? And there was good feedback.
Yep.
You were on the call. Did you learn anything interesting?
Yeah, well, it was the first call that I've attended, so it was a good experience for me to just kind of get into the flow of how the calls work. And there's even like a little lingo in the chat that like when somebody has a question, you put in a Q plus. I didn't know that before, but now I do. So it's typical of any organization you get involved with. They all have their own little ways of doing things that you have to get acclimated to. So but it was good to see. It was very respectful, and I like the way that there's like an agenda and it keeps getting moved forward, and it was very nicely time boxed, which I thought worked well. Mm-hmm. It was getting toward the end of the meeting, and whoever, I forget who was leading it, but he was kind of like, all right, we're going to need to cut the mic on this topic because we only have a few minutes left. We got to keep it moving. And especially with the frequency with which you're having the meetings now, I think it makes sense to do it that way. It gives you a chance to digest everything that was talked about. You can come back next week, fresh, and I thought it moved things along pretty well. I'm getting acclimated myself to the whole mailing list system, which it's got to be 10 plus years since I've used a mailing list of this type. And I sent my first thing off to the mailing list this week, and I just realized, before our happy hour today, like I didn't see a response. I don't know if it made it there. It might just be my filter settings on my mail, because at first it was like a fire hose, and then I turned it to the Daily Digest, but then I wasn't getting enough. So, there's a little tweaking of all of that to do, but you've been very vocal about like inviting people to getting involved in it. And it can be a little daunting at first because you and other people have been involved in the process for so long. But for anybody that's connected, I just want to let you know, like, if you just kind of jump in, it does seem a little daunting at first, but you get acclimated pretty quickly, and it's very open. People are very willing to take input and participation is encouraged.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of inner knowledge about how the group works and lingo and weird mechanics. Wait till you come to one of the in-person meetings and they do the voting by humming, because that's an experience. Let me tell you.
Oh, nice.
Also, does not work online. Absolutely not.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Yeah, but yeah, the other part of this is that like a lot of people are working. There's a lot of people in the group, and a lot of people are working on it either because they personally want to or because it's part of their job, and everybody's coming at it from different backgrounds and different like what they want, different things of what they want out of it. So it's not like everybody is paying attention to every thread all the time because there's just too much for that. Instead, people like tend to focus on the particular aspects that they're interested in. So, and then everybody, of course, is like working on this whenever it's, whenever their job lets them, whenever they can fit it in between other projects, or if it is their full-time thing. It's different for everybody. So the speed at which the discussions move varies wildly based on what the topic is. And since you made a comment on my draft, I owe you a response to that. And I have not had time to do that yet. So that's on me.
Yeah, no worries.
Let's take a look at
It's
the
a
chat
lot,
again.
it's bringing
Yeah, no, it's
in,
definitely a lot.
what's that?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot.
Yeah. What I like is we have a slide that we use in our developer workshops where it shows like a maze of different RFCs that you go down a rabbit hole pretty quickly when you start to get into OAuth. So what I'm excited about for OAuth 2.1 is kind of bringing all that under one umbrella and consolidating it all like a one-stop shop for like, this is OAuth 2.1. This is the specification. And, there's always going to be call outs to other RFCs because, there's JWT and other things that are involved, but like the core of it is going to be in one place. Whereas right now, in about, a minute digging through the original one, you start branching off to the extensions and various things that are just in popular use now because it's, 8 years later or whatever from where we started or longer.
Yep. I have the maze graphic. I just like this picture.
This would be a great quiz, Aaron, for part of the reworking that we're doing with the developer workshop. Like, who can attach a label to each of those RFC numbers off the top of their head?
Oh, I love it. Yeah. Oh, that's also something that's super funny to me is in-person discussions, once you start having talks with people about these, like at the ITF meetings, people will actually start referring to drafts by their number as a shorthand. And like a couple of them I'm totally familiar with, like 6750 is bearer token, 6749 is OAuth 2.0, because that's where everything starts. And
Yeah.
after that, I start to get lost pretty quick on remembering the numbers. But some people just throw out the numbers of as if like you're supposed to remember the numbers for all of these,
Right.
and forgetting that it takes a lot of experience to be able to do that and actually have some context for those. Yeah.
Yeah. I had that as an interview question once in the context of HTTP, like how many HTTP response codes did I know what they meant? It wasn't like this is going to make or break you getting your job. It was supposed to be like an icebreaker, like a fun thing.
Okay.
And apparently I came in second place on their all-time leaderboard, but I definitely could not do the same thing for RFCs.
That's great. All RFCs, that would be a challenge. Yeah. That'd be a super challenge. Let me take a look at chat again. I think we got some more questions here. Yeah. So from Dimitri, how would you manage a token refresh with the public client JavaScript app if the refresh token should not be stored on the client? Some approach that more user-friendly do not make user login every hour or less. Yeah, this is a question that we get a lot because this is definitely a concern. You want to balance security with usability, right? So the usability is you don't want people to have to log in every hour or day or whatever your token lifetime is. And on the flip side, you want access tokens that last a short amount of time. You don't want to issue forever access tokens. So what's the balance there? Well, refresh tokens were created for exactly that purpose. Refresh tokens were meant to be the way to get short access tokens, but not have the user log in every time. There's definitely some concerns with storing refresh tokens in JavaScript apps. But before I get to that, no, I do want to talk about those. So the concerns around storing them are that in a public client, when there's no client secret, the refresh token becomes like the ultimate key to the account, right? So because as soon as somebody steals the refresh token, they can just keep getting new access tokens then. And that's the main concern. So in a confidential client, when there's a secret, a stolen refresh token doesn't really matter because they can't do anything with it. In a public client, they could then use it for anything. And this is, again, one of the things that that is being talked about in the security best current practice as well as OAuth 2.1. And one of the solutions is that you do use refresh tokens in single page apps so that you can use short token lifetimes, but the refresh tokens become one-time use. So by doing that, as soon as the app uses the refresh token, it doesn't matter if somebody steals it because it's used up. And they get a new refresh token back in that response, right? And that gives you the benefits of refresh tokens, and you then don't have the risks of the stolen refresh tokens. The risk moves. It becomes if someone can steal the refresh token out of the app, and the app doesn't know about it, then if both the attacker and the real app try to use it at the same time or alternating, the authorization server can tell that something's wrong and just shut down the whole thing, right? So it can prevent that attack, which is great. So do you have anything else on that, Micah? Because there's a couple of other answers to this too.
Well, I do want to speak a little bit to the Okta specific case about how it addresses this currently, because this is something you can take advantage of today, but it is specific to Okta and kind of outside of OAuth. It's a little bit of a hybrid. So I can wait on that if there's more to say about, what is specific to OAuth.
The other thing I wanted to mention was that if you can't rotate your refresh tokens every time, which I'm hearing some people are saying that is getting to be a challenge, in some cases a challenge, because it means that applications have to make sure that they're always parallelizing or not parallelizing requests and are always making sequential requests. So if you can't rotate them, then you probably shouldn't issue them to JavaScript apps. So instead, you can still avoid the user logging in, but you would still have them do a redirect. So just because they are redirected to the OAuth server, they don't actually have to be prompted for their password, right? They can actually do a redirect, be already logged in, and then come and get bounced back. And you see this all the time with apps in the real world. Like if you are on GitHub, you logged into GitHub, and then you go to like travissci.org and try to log in via GitHub, you're not going to see a login prompt on GitHub. You're going to basically end up back at Travis CI almost instantly because the redirect happens so quickly. So that's the same thing with your single page apps where you do get redirected out and then you come back, which reloads the app, but then it's done the Pixie flow by that point and it's got the access token, the new access token. And sure, there's a usability concern there of, well, you have to go out and do a redirect and back. So yeah, make sure your app loads quickly. Don't deliver people an 8 megabyte single page app that's going to take 5 seconds to boot up, because that's ridiculous. Stop doing that, right? Make your app boot up quickly, make it very responsive. Because if you do a web server based app and just write server side code, it turns out those things are snappy as heck, right? Those things load instantly, and you can even be doing requests in the background on them to be getting the new access token. Whenever I do the demo about of writing an OAuth client from scratch, I'm writing it in PHP because it's just like on my laptop and it's easy to do, and there's no frameworks, nothing to install. And I have to always explain, okay, when I click this link, you're not going to see anything happen. I'm just going to get bounced right back to this page, and you're going to see the text on the page. And I have to explain that it is actually doing a redirect out to Okta and back. And we're getting the authorization code from Okta. It just happens so quick that nobody can see it. I think that's a good selling point, that like it's not the redirect that's slow, it's your stupid 8 MB app that's slow. So fix that, right? Anyway, do you have something about Okta specifically that you wanted to
Yeah,
talk
well,
about?
just before that, you just reminded me because it comes up a lot, and it, at least in my experience working with other developers, it's pretty rare these days that you have a pure spa app with no backing services at all. Now, if you do have a pure spa app, then you have to deal with this issue. But if you have a backing service, a PHP, .NET, Java, Node.js, some backend service, then the best security footing and the best user experience footing is to have all of the OAuth stuff happening in that middleware, because then it can keep the tokens, it can safely keep a client secret, you can do regular old refresh tokens, and then your React app or your Angular app is just using its native session mechanism to keep things in sync with the middleware that you have. And so the Spa app never needs to have a token. You get all the benefits of refresh tokens, the benefit of balancing security and user experience. So that's kind of like the best of all worlds if you can do that. If you are in a situation where it's a pure spa app, the way that Okta mitigates this issue, and you may or may not have noticed this if you've used any of our JavaScript clients, whether it's React, Vue, Angular, or just the raw Auth.js, because Okta sets its session cookie when you go through any of the auth flows, when that access token expires, the Auth.js library just leverages that session cookie. This has nothing to do with OAuth, but it leverages that session cookie. It makes a connection to Okta, and Okta just returns a new access token. So it's kind of like the idea of a refresh token without it being a formal OAuth refresh token. But it is specific to Okta. It's outside of OAuth, but it's a way that a pure spa app that's using Okta can have that balance. You can still have very short-lived access tokens, and the app can go and get new access tokens when they expire, and it's completely transparent to the user, but it's happening because of that Okta session ID.
So it's almost
Cookie.
like the session ID is the refresh token, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the way
It's
it's
just,
being used. It just isn't OAuth.
yeah. It's not described in OAuth, but it seems like the same mechanism, except that of course because it's a cookie, the JavaScript doesn't actually need to get a hold of it because it can
That's
be
right.
HTTP only, which is the benefit
Yeah.
there.
And it is
Yeah,
HTTP only. So you get a reasonable level of security and still have the ability to get fresh access tokens when they expire.
yeah,
And you get all the other benefits of it having to hit Okta in order for that to happen. So if the user's account has been locked or something
right.
else has happened in the interim, then they won't get back the new access token, and the SPA app will deal with that error in whatever way it's set up to do so. But you get the benefit of the short-lived access token and still not having a refresh token that could possibly be leaked or intercepted or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's another question. It's a two-parter. I can only show one part at a time. So here's a scenario. Public client, no user interaction. The only requirement is to try to allow access to an API to just allowed clients. Does it make sense to try to add authentication in this case? The client is public. I think there's no way to safely store a secret. Is there any alternative? Yeah, that's a tricky one. If this truly is a public client, like a single page app or a mobile app with no user, then it depends. I guess it depends on how it's deployed. So if we typically are concerned with the case of shipping client secrets in mobile apps or in a single page app, because you can't do that, right? You can't put a secret into your JavaScript source or in a mobile app in the App Store. because it would then get shipped down to users and everybody would have the same secret. And so then it's not secret anymore. If that's the case, if that's actually the situation you're in, if you're like trying to make an app store app and add some sort of authentication to it, that's not going to help you. That's not going to do it. And the best it's going to do is it's security by obscurity of your API. So at least your API doesn't have to be a completely public endpoint, but anybody who wanted to would be able to make that request fairly easily. If they want to actually track down what your app is doing and reverse engineer it, they can do it fine. It just means that it wouldn't be necessarily on the public internet with no authentication. If you have the ability to configure this single page app or mobile app with an API key after it's deployed, then you can treat it like a confidential client. And again, like it's treading the line there because depending on the single page app environment and like what else is on that device, there may be other concerns there, but at least you would have a specific secret for that one instance so that you're then only concerned about what happens if someone actually breaks into that instance and steals the secret out of it, which is a very different threat than shipping a client secret in a mobile app. But it's very likely the case that any sort of authentication you add in this situation is not actually adding authentication, it's just adding obscurity. Does that seem like a fair assessment, Micah?
Yep. No, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a tricky one for sure. One of the workshops I did, there was someone who was describing their solution because they did want the assurance on a device that this was the real app, and they actually had before it could like log into a system, so they can't ship a client secret in the app. When it's deployed, they have to later enroll the device in order to add a secret into the device later. That process involved this person with the app. Every person would have to go drive like 2 hours to the middle of wherever this office was and go to a desk, show their ID, enroll the device, which I assume meant that they put some sort of certificate or key into the device, which it would then use to authenticate all the OAuth calls. And then a mobile app can be a confidential client because, yeah, that deploying that secret was then a very restricted one-time thing.
Yeah.
And no one's gonna be able to steal that.
You just reminded me of another facet of the way that refresh tokens are addressed in 2.1. You talked about the rotation idea, but there's another one that's part of it that involves, it was like an either or. Either you have to rotate or you need to have this other thing, which I didn't fully understand. Is that certificate based? Some sort of way of client identification?
So the wording in the spec, this is actually an interesting point of contention, I guess I would say, almost. Let me go back and show this. It's in 2.1, but it's in the security best current practice, which is why it's in 2.1. 2.1
Right.
is not defining anything new. It's just rolling up a bunch of specs. So that's
Right.
in the security best current practice under, I asked them to move this. I don't think they have yet. Here it is. So refresh token protection, the requirement is that, here are the two.
Yeah,
Either
sender
refresh token
constrained.
rotation or sender constrained. So sender constrained refresh tokens is a general term for the concept of you need something other than the refresh token itself in order to use it. So you add some other authentication there. The easiest way is I guess like using a client secret, right? Because then the client secret's required in order to use the refresh token.
Right.
That obviously doesn't help you with public clients because public clients don't have a client secret. So in that case, you end up, well, there isn't really a good solution right now. There are a couple of attempts at solutions, and I would say none of them are really widely deployed or widely supported. One of them is, I think this is, mutual TLS. So that the idea there is that it moves the authentication into the transport layer instead of in the application layer. So instead of like a client secret, which gets sent in the wire of in the HTTP request, this actually is before HTTP. It's in the TLS layer. So it's a bidirectional TLS connection, so that the server authenticates the client just like the client authenticates the server. That's one way to do it. That is useful in some cases and challenging in others. And there's a lot of people who are saying that it's too much of a burden to deploy in certain situations, so they're not doing it. Whatever. There's another option here, not an RFC yet. It's just a draft. It's called token binding. It's actually it needs an update since there hasn't been an update in a while, in over a year. So we'll see. This is like, again, this is an attempt, but this is not yet an RFC. It's hasn't been updated in a while, so who knows how widely deployed this actually is. There's another one which is called demonstration of proof of possession, or DPOP, which I apparently don't have on this list. Oops. I need to add that. OAuth DPOP. This is another attempt at doing proof of possession or sender constrained tokens. This time it is in the application layer. The theory with this spec was that mutual TLS is too cumbersome because it requires special server-side TLS stack and special client-side TLS stack in order to do the mutual TLS. So instead, let's put it in the application layer where you actually can write code. But again, both have trade-offs. Neither of those are obviously the correct answer. So that's what that means. That's what sender constraint means. Is you need something other than the refresh token in order to use it, and what that actually is way up in the air right now. Like,
Yeah.
not a good answer, and there's no solid plan.
Seems like the more common approach is going to end up being rotation.
I would think so. It feels easier to me. The only concern really is that, like, I guess on a
Parallel.
mobile app I can see it. Yeah, because mobile apps tend to have a lot of things going on in parallel. So it just needs to make sure that it doesn't try to use a refresh token more than once, because if it does, it'll trigger the the hack alarms.
Right.
What are words? I forgot how words work. But it just means that, like, the app has to have some special, a special pipe that all the requests for new access tokens go through, that is able to serialize them so that it can't make accidentally two requests in parallel for access tokens. Which is, it's some work, but I think that's a lot simpler to me than dealing with mutual TLS or even Depop. But we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah.
There's still a lot more work to do on that front, obviously.
So did you take a note to yourself to add Depop into the list of
and that's
connection points
or
there?
If anybody else wants to, go ahead, because that site's open source. Just go to OAuth.net, and there's a link at the bottom. Send a pull request. I'll send you an OAuth sticker if you do that. So feel free. I have shiny OAuth stickers.
Nice.
So we're at the top of the hour. We should wrap up and give people some links of where to go for further information. I should plug my my book, which you can read for free at OAuth.com. If you want a print version of the book, it's available at OAuth2simplified.com, or as I like to use on slides, OAuth.wtf is redirects to there as well.
Nice.
We also have the OAuth Playground at OAuth.com/playground, and this is a fun walkthrough of all the different flows. And you can try out the different flows that are in OAuth and see what those look like. Lastly, I want to mention the Okta developer accounts. So developer.okta.com, that is a free developer account from Okta, and go there and try out our tutorials and trainings and stuff. I use this in my workshops all the time for demoing stuff. So there's no like time limit. It's just like number of active users. So anyway, that's a good resource. So yeah, do check out my book. And it looks like we've lost Micah, but thank you all for joining the stream. And we'll do this again next week. So same time, same place. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we will, again, just join next week and we'll keep chatting. So hopefully there will be some more fun OAuth news by the time next week rolls around. So thank you everybody for joining and have a great rest of the day.